So, dear colleagues, it's a pleasure today to host Mark Pollard for this colloquium, which is most interesting, and I hope we will find a lot of interesting and thoughts for that. So let me introduce first Mark. He's, like me, a physicist, but he spent, like me, all his life long. He applied physics to archaeology and cultural heritage. And so he had a long career. He is now emeritus from Oxford University. I will take my notes to read exactly the name of it's Edward Hall, Archaeological Science at the University of Oxford. He was retired a few years ago, 2 years ago, almost at the same time as mine. So it's a real colleague, and I'm very pleased with that. So he had a diploma in physics, and which was developed on the degradation of glass artifacts. And then he works in the laboratory in Oxford, which developed a carbon-14 spectrometer, one of the first accelerator devoted for carbon-14 measurements in Oxford, the Laboratory for Archaeology and the History of Art. And then he moved to Cardiff University, and after that, University of Bradford. And finally, in 2004, he was professor at Edward Hall at Oxford University, as I mentioned. But he's also an important person for the Cyprus Institute. He is the chair of the CEP of Stasi, and for that is very interesting and important to host him. And I wish to express and to take advantage to express that Mark is much involved in this duty of being the chair of the CEP, and he strongly supports Stasi as a whole. The idea of the present colloquium arose during a symposium in India. I think it was in India. I don't remember the specific location, but when Mark met Effie Nikita. And Effie Nikita, thanks to her, we have Mark here. And we will hear from Mark how Alexander was involved in the development of China and the development of Buddhism, as far as understood. And the title of his talk is 13 years that changed China. So 336 to 334 before Christ, the expansion of Alexander into Asia. So how two well-known historical events, so the conquest of Alexander in Central Asia in this period, and the movement of the development of the Buddhism in this region at the same period. So now, Mark, the floor is yours, and I thank you very much again to share with us this topic.
Thank you, Michel. President and friends and colleagues, it's a great pleasure to be here in the Cyprus Institute. I realized the other day that I've been coming here since 2008, 2009, something like that, and I've never actually given a talk about my own research. So I thought, well, perhaps it's time to inflict upon the poor Cyprus Institute, some thoughts of mine about China and other things. I feel slightly guilty. This is a talk that I gave some of this in China. Evie and I met in Beijing in China, and I gave part of this talk in China, and I'm now giving an expanded version here in Greece. But I'm very conscious that actually when I'm in China, I'm trying to tell the Chinese things about Chinese history that they already know far better than I do. And I'm also conscious that when I come to the Greek-speaking world and start talking about Alexander, I'm talking to people, again, who know far more than I do about Alexander. But I think the thing that I can offer is to bring these things together in a way which I think sometimes it takes an outsider to see some connections, make some linkages. So I hope you'll bear with me and not be too critical of my lack of knowledge of Alexander the Great and all that he did. And I'm going to link these two events in a way that I think is novel, relatively novel. And I'm going to use that as a stepping stone to a larger set of questions, which I'll come to later on, none of which we know the answer to. So like many of my talks, we will end up with more questions at the end than we had at the beginning. That's the intention. I'm trying to engage some thought and discussion. So the title is 13 Years That Changed China. It started out as 13 Years That Changed the World, which I think is probably also a valid title. I think the argument that the expansion of Alexander into Central Asia and Northern India changed the whole of the Eurasian continent forever. Just 13 years. It's really quite remarkable. So that's one of the things that I find intriguing. Firstly, I want to show you an object which my jaw dropped when I saw this. I'm sure you'll all recognize a Hellenistic style object, but it comes from a royal grave of the Xiongnu, a group in Central Asia, and it comes from one of the royal burials, and the burial dates to about the 1st century CE, Common Era. And it's a silver, well, it's now a dish, a plate, but if you can see around the edges, there are little holes, and it had been converted from whatever it had been into a piece that hung on a horse's bridle. The Xiongnu are nomads, horse riders, and so they converted this object. But let me just show you who the Xiongnu were. It's completely remarkable. This is a map of Han Dynasty China about the 1st century BC, AD, sometime like that. The greatest extent of the Chinese Han Dynasty Empire into the western regions. The Xiongnu live up here based largely around what is modern-day Mongolia. And they were a nomadic tribe, and the Han Dynasty, the Central Chinese Dynasty, and the Xiongnu Confederation were at constant warfare. The Xiongnu continuously invaded the northern borders of China, partly why some of the Great Walls were built to try and control the Xiongnu. There's been 2,000 years of enmity between the settled area of China and the nomadic tribes to the north and the west. So this object showing up in a Xiongnu grave is really spectacular, because we didn't know that the Xiongnu had contacts beyond the contacts that they had with China. So possibly this object came through from the Hellenistic world into China and up to the Xiongnu, or possibly the Xiongnu had their own connections with the West. We don't know. This is fairly new stuff. If we look at the other end of the scale, this is another remarkable object. This is a statue, a cast statue of the Buddha, or a Buddhist figure. This one appeared in a Viking Age grave in Sweden, dated to around 800 CE. So at the other end, you've got these Buddhist objects, or this Buddhist object, showing up in a Viking Age grave. So there's absolutely nothing new about continental trade, continental travel. What links them, of course, is the very well-known thing, or things called the Silk Roads, a web of tracks across mountain and desert through Central Asia, leading into Dunhuang, which is the place where the desert region starts, and down ultimately into central China. And these reached a peak during the Han Dynasty, sort of 1st, 2nd centuries. But they must have been in existence long before that. I think these are tracks and trade routes which were in existence from prehistoric times. And then with the Han expansion, it became a link between the Roman world at that time and the Han Dynasty, the Chinese Han Dynasty. So we're really talking about stuff traveling along these many tracks that we now call the Silk Roads. So, Alexander, you know all about Alexander. Assumed the throne of Macedonia after his father Philip was assassinated, united the Corinthian League of city-states in Greece, became the leader of the city-states, and then embarked upon this remarkable conquest of all of the known world at that time. So from 334 BCE, he travelled. He travelled into Persia, Iran, and finished off the Iranian, the Achaemenid dynasty. Sorry, I wander around too much. Sorry. He's not uniformly popular in some parts of the world. I think in Iran he's still referred to as Alexander the Destroyer, because he destroyed Persepolis and finished off the kingdom there. But he then carried on, moved eastwards. It ended up in the Upper Ganges, in this region here. And according to simple history, he was all for going on and crossing the Ganges and continuing into Upper India. But I think his troops said, you know, we've had enough. We're going home, sort of thing. And so he withdrew. He died in Babylon, and then his body was taken wherever you think his body was taken. So at the largest extent, this is an empire which for a very brief time, for 15, 16 years, united the Hellenistic world out here with the Persian Empire and the Central Asian empires. The area that's of most interest to me is this area which became known as Gandhara, which is modern-day northern Pakistan, southern Afghanistan, and we'll hear a little more about what happened in Gandhara shortly. But again, as you know better than me, the empire collapsed. There was no successor. There was the wars of the Diadochi. The wars between the successors, the four, they split into four, and eventually each of them collapsed. And so that was the end of what was a remarkable period in history. But what I want to argue is it triggered a series of events which led to major changes across all of Eurasia. So Gandhara, this northern part of Pakistan, Afghanistan, became part of the Mauryan Empire, which was a northern Indian empire, the most famous ruler of which is a man called Ashoka the Great in the 300-250 sort of period, and he ruled the empire in the mid-3rd century BCE. Now, a historian refers to these events as the Hellenistic period of Indian history. So even though the Alexandrian Empire had collapsed, the influence of the Hellenistic world was still there, still present. The rulers still spoke Greek, and this linked, and imported objects, including many bronzes of Roman or Alexandrian provenance, found in the great cities of the northwest and in the upper Kabul Valley. So there's this movement of material, ideas, people out of the Hellenistic world into this area of northern India. Now, the Mauryan Empire, at its greatest extent, is here, sort of most of India, north of the very southern part, and up into the mountains. Taxila, now in Pakistan, was probably the capital of the Gandharan area. But the key thing about this is that Ashoka the Great converted to Buddhism in about 260 BCE. We know that to be true, but the explanation we have only comes from Buddhist scripts which were written 300-400 years later. So we don't know that they are contemporary. But the story goes that Ashoka won a great battle, killed many hundreds of thousands of men, and then decided it wasn't for him and that he was going to become a Buddhist, and he converted the entire Mauryan Empire into Buddhism. And the most famous manifestation of that, a set of monuments called the Edicts of Ashoka the Great, stelae with script in both Greek and other languages, carvings, caves, 27 great monuments to Buddhism. So it's quite clear that Ashoka the Great really took on this Buddhism stuff and converted the whole empire, including this northwestern part here. There then followed a period called the Euthydemed dynasty, which is another Hellenistic Greek-speaking dynasty called the Greco-Bactrian or Indo-Greek kingdoms. You can see it here again around Sogdiana, an important region for trade along the Silk Road, and along, there's another Alexandria there and Alexandria there. He was quite keen on his Alexandrias. So you end up through to the Common Era with a government in this northwest part of Pakistan, which was the elite of whom at least were Greek-speaking, and almost certainly still in contact with the Hellenistic world from which they'd come. So, and that gave rise to one of the great traditions of art in the world, which is known as Gandharan or Greco-Buddhist art. And here's a statue of probably a Greek god, but then you get the thing that it's most famous for, the images of the Buddha in very realistic carving, sculpture, something that hadn't been seen in this part of the world or in China. So the sequence of events from Alexander through Ashoka into this region brought Greco-Buddhist art into northern India. And then the story of the arrival of Buddhism into China is pretty well documented. It's assumed that Buddhism travelled along the Central Asian Silk Roads into Western China, and then into Central China overland. The earliest Chinese references are in the Western Han Dynasty, so 221 to 9. There were several expeditions sent by the Han emperors to the west, partly to control the Xiongnu, partly to maintain the freedom of travel along the Silk Road. And these brought back several manuscripts which still survive, the Journey to the West, and various texts which talk about this area. So this area was known to the Chinese because of their expansion. And the earliest Buddhist temple was established in Luoyang, I think around 69 AD, 67 AD, somewhere like that. It's called the White Temple, the White Horse Temple, because the legend goes that a monk arrived on a white horse and said, "This is where we have a temple." It's no longer extant, sadly, but so we know by the early part of this Common Era, we know that Buddhism had arrived in China. It was a religion of the elite. It was a religion which was adopted by the elite and trickled down into the community. It wasn't a common popular movement. China at that time would have been a mixture of, well, probably still shamanistic, but also Confucian, similar, and Taoism would have been the native religion. So, why go over old ground? Well, the hypothesis that I'm working on is that this link between Alexander, northern Gandhara, this created a link by which not only religion but technology moved. And my argument is that the movement of Buddhism into China brought with it something very new for China, which was the casting of figures, human figures. They were unknown in Shang Dynasty China, largely. It brought with them, so the idea of casting statues of figures was new and was brought with Buddhism. And the predominant color of these statues was yellow. Yellow was the color of the Buddha's skin. And so there are two ways of making a statue look yellow. One is to make it out of brass, the alloy of copper and zinc, which looks yellow, or to make it out of copper and give it a gilded golden coating. And so this combination of statues, figures, and possibly the idea of casting figures in brass came with Buddhism and entered into China. So that's the argument that I've been putting. Other things came with it, of course. Those of you familiar with Western architecture will probably look at this and say nothing unusual there. It's from Yungang, Buddhist grottos set up in Datong around the 5th, 6th century. So there are statues of the Buddha in niches, but surrounding it are these columns and columns here. These are unknown in Chinese art up till this date. China had no tradition of building in stone. So it had no tradition of making temples out of stone. Everything was built of rammed earth and wood. So it would have been familiar with columns, wooden columns, but the idea of columns like this, I think, were completely unknown. So to a Western eye, this looks, okay, that's interesting, but to the Chinese eye, I think this would have been really quite remarkable to see these elements of Western architecture coming into China along with Buddhism. So I need to take a little digression here just to say why this alloy that we're very familiar with called brass, copper and zinc is somewhat unusual or different. From a Western perspective, the alloy of brass, copper and zinc was the last of the copper alloys to be made on any great scale. We're familiar with copper, tin bronze, leaded tin bronze, arsenical coppers. Brass as a copper and zinc alloy came quite late to the Western party, if I can put it that way. And the reason is not difficult to understand from a technical point of view. The metal zinc is volatile. It boils at 907 degrees centigrade. So at any sort of normal metallurgical working temperature, it's going to volatilize, turn to zinc oxide, and you get clouds of white smoke coming off it, which in Persian is called tutiya, white, which is where the tutti comes from. So so you can't make the alloy of copper and zinc by just taking metallic zinc and mixing it with metallic copper, which is the way you would make a tin bronze, metallic tin, metallic copper. So it had to be made in a different way, and there's been a lot written about various processes which use not metallic zinc, but calamine, smithsonite, zinc carbonate, the mineral, in a sort of a reducing enclosed environment. And as you heat it up, the zinc vapor diffuses into the metal copper. It's a solid state reaction. A solid gas reaction. The gas is absorbed by the copper. And this came late. We'll talk in a minute about where it comes from, but this came late. Metallic zinc itself was unknown in Europe until the 17th century, when it was imported from China. And in China and India, you get the distillation of zinc using a set of retorts, and I can't remember which way around. In India, they're horizontal, and in China, they're vertical. I think that's right, but if it's not, it's the other way around. So they perfected the distillation of zinc, made metallic zinc in about the 14th century, AD, CE, we don't exactly know when. And eventually that zinc arrived in Europe aboard the sea routes and was eventually copied in Europe. So the orthodox history of brass, if I can just summarize it, and this is from a Western perspective. I'm going to say a little more in a minute about a Chinese perspective. In the archaeological record, we see what we might call as sporadic occurrences of alloys containing some zinc from the 3rd millennium BCE, around then, and they tend to contain about 10 or 12% zinc. And this, I think, is best interpreted. If I use the word accidental, I don't mean that it was an accident, but I mean it was a process by which they probably, I wouldn't say again, didn't have much control over, but what they were doing was just either a single smelt of a mixed copper zinc ore, or they're mixing zinc ore with copper, and when you smelt it, some of it gets retained. But it's rare in the archaeological record. It doesn't become a common alloy until the Romans in the 1st century well, CE really, adopted it as one of their main alloys for making coinage. And it was made by some form of indirect process. This was identified by a German scholar called Martin Heinrich Klaproth. And for many years, we assumed that there was a thermodynamic control over how much zinc you can get into copper. We used to think that it was a thermodynamic limitation on the diffusion of zinc into copper. Subsequent work, particularly by French colleagues, has shown that it isn't a thermodynamic limit, but in practice, there is a limit on how much zinc you get in objects before about the 16th century. And then for a British audience, it was Champion in Bristol patented the process, which he'd taken from India or China. He patented the process and used a granulated process which increases the uptake of zinc. So for many years we've thought it was thermodynamically limited, but it probably isn't, but it's practically limited, let's just put it that way. This is a diagram from some work we did a few years ago on the zinc content of Roman coinage from the early period, Augustus, a little bit of the Republic, but Augustus right through to about 250, the mid-3rd century. And the green line is the median value of zinc. There's something like 3,000 or 4,000 coins in this database, so it's relatively robust, although it's very patchy. There are some emperors, it's done by emperor. There are some emperors where we have very few coins or very little data on the coins. But you can see it goes from nothing in the Republican, the late Republic, up to about 20%. And then for the first century, it stays around 20%. And then it gradually declines. And this was a phenomenon noted by a very fine scholar called Earl Cayley in America, who labeled this the zinc decline. Unfortunately, we went a bit further than Cayley did, and you get a sort of a resurrection in the 3rd century for reasons I don't understand. But so this is just the Roman background to zinc, and you can see that typically it's about 20% maximum. Some go up over here, but very few go above 25%. So even though we now know it's not a thermodynamic control, it's a practical control. A few years ago, we put together a database on a project called FLAME, Flow of Ancient Metals Across Eurasia. And this is a section of that database. We gathered about 10,000 analyses of bronze objects from Western Asia. These are not our analyses. These are analyses that were done back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So there's variable reliability amongst them and all of that. But amongst the 10,000 coins, 10,000 objects that we got data for, 37 of them contain zinc. So when I say it's a rare occurrence, I mean 37 out of 10,000 that we know of have this thing in it. So it's pretty rare. And a bit of mapping, it goes the wrong way, but this is the mid-3rd millennium BCE, and you can the size of the blob shows the number of objects. So, and it's not geolocated, it's located on modern country because we don't have geolocation for many of these objects. But in the mid-3rd millennium, you see there's a lot of alloy. Well, relatively speaking, there's only 37 in total, but relatively speaking, there's a lot in the Caucasus area. So that leads me, and maybe some others, to think that the origin of this accidental, in quotes, alloy is somewhere in the Caucasus, Georgia, very rich metal area. It sort of disappears by the early 3rd century. By the late 3rd century, you know, 1 or 2 examples, and then it returns in the early 1st millennium, which is the beginning of what we know into the Roman period. So the temptation is to assume that this shows that this, I'll call it a strange alloy, it's not a strange alloy, but this unusual material is rare, but comes from somewhere probably around Georgia in that period. This is the key figure that leads me to suggest that it's Buddhism that brings this alloy into Central Asia and China. So this is time along here, minus 600 through to about 1000 CE. Each dot is an analysis of the zinc concentration. That object is the strangest object in the world. It comes from Taxila, and it's said to have 34% zinc in it. We don't know where it is now. We don't know whether it's a true analysis. We don't know anything about it. If it's true, it's absolutely remarkable, but there you go, it's there. The red dots are non-Buddhist objects, and the yellow, the golden color of the Buddha's skin are Buddhist objects. And you can see that, so this is across Central Asia and into Western China. So the Hershey Corridor, Gansu, and into Western China. And you can see a big rise in Buddhist objects which contain a certain amount of zinc. Earliest is around 100, 200. Scholars dispute whether these are really Buddhist, but I'm not going to go into that. But certainly by about 300 or 400, you begin to see a big change. This line marks the date of the construction of Yungang, the cave temples that I showed you at the beginning. So I'm convinced, but I'm not sure everybody else is convinced, that brass is associated with Buddhism, and you can trace that link back to Alexander the Great. But I'm now going to go controversial. I'm going to suggest that not only did brass come with Buddhism, but the art of lost wax casting came with Buddhism. Now, if you were an audience of Chinese scholars, there'd be half of you shouting by now to say, no, this is not true, this is not true. I'll show you some evidence why they think it's not true. But it's certainly the case that once you start casting human figures, and that lost wax is a good technique, and we know lost wax was used in Western Asia long before this. So I'm putting forward the argument that lost wax casting came with Buddhism. If we just look at the Chinese tradition, this is a rather spectacular object. It's called Humuwu Ding, or colloquially known as the Big Ding. And it's the Big Ding because it weighs 833 kilograms. It's the largest single object from the ancient world, copper object. It's immense. It comes from a tomb, there's an inscription in it, and it comes from Fu Jing, who it was made for Fu Jing, who was the first wife of the Emperor Wu Ding, who is the man who sent the army into Western Asia to secure the Silk Road. And so it dates to about 1250, 1200 BCE. It's massive. just to show, although this is a remarkable tomb from Anyang, this is the tomb of Fu Hao, Lady Fu Hao, who was the third wife of Wu Ding, so she was 2 steps down, so she didn't get a big ding, but she got lots of, she got lots of what you might say are little dings. And this tomb is important because it's the only unrobbed royal tomb from dynastic China. It's the only tomb that's been excavated in modern times that hasn't been robbed. And it contains 1.6 tons of copper objects. So even though she was the third one, she was an interesting character. She was a general in the army as well. So she was obviously quite a character. But so Fu Hao's tomb has got 1.6 tons of copper in it. So they were, they were big on copper, I think. But the traditional Chinese technique for making vessels is called piece molding, and it's uniquely Chinese. Basically, it's a series of interlocking molds which are made, fired, and cast, and then locked together, and then the bronze is cast into it. And it's a uniquely Chinese process. It appears around the Shang dynasty, about 1800, maybe a bit later, 1600 BC. And there's nothing like it in the West. So for 1,000 years, they're doing this. And I think it's based on 2 things. One is China's long tradition of high-temperature ceramics. They were firing ceramics at 1,300 degrees, 4000 BC, they were serious about it. And also the unique properties of the Loess clay deposits that exist all across northern China. It's a perfect refractory material. So, that's how they did it. Now in China, there's huge debates about how they actually got the decoration on there. Some people say it was carved into the mold. Some people say it was done in other ways, and I'm not going to put my head into that tiger's jaw. But the thing is, it's piece molding. Lost wax casting is the European tradition, if you like, and certainly goes back to the 3rd millennium. This is a very famous figure from Mohenjo-daro in Pakistan called the Dancing Girl, which is said to be one of the earliest lost wax castings that we have. And lost wax, as the name suggests, there are variants on it, but basically you have a model in wax, you put a mold round it, in it, you fire the mold, melt the wax out, put the bronze in. Perfect for making hollow statues and things like that. So when you see something like this, you begin to say, what the expletive deleted, what is going on here? This is from China. This is a bronze table from another unrobbed royal tomb, but not a Shang tomb. It's from the Zheng state further out, tributaries to the Western Zhou, but not part of, strictly speaking. It's from the Warring States period, so it's around 433 BCE. But just look at that. How do you make that? Now, again, in China, people tear each other apart over arguing about how something like this was made. There are many very serious scholars who say this can only have been done by lost wax casting. There are many other equally distinguished scholars who said, no, it's not lost wax, it's something different. So if you look at, this is perhaps the most famous object from Marquis Yi's tomb. The decoration is just phenomenal. And I put this up because it's interlocking. I mean, how do you do that? How do you do that is the question. Now, there are many papers, I've quoted one, but there are hundreds, particularly in Chinese. This one's in English, which argues this is lost wax casting. It's 330 BC, so it's pre-Alexander. So China had lost wax casting before any Hellenistic influence came in. Well, there are intermediates. There are other ways of doing. This is rather intriguing. This is what I call lost fibre. I think it's got a proper name, but this is a handle on an earlier piece from the spring and autumn period, about 770, and it's quite clearly a rope that's been put in the mould, burnt out, and then the bronze goes in. So there are variants which you might argue are quite similar to lost wax, but the long and the short of it is we don't know when lost wax casting arrived in China and whether it was indigenous or not. So that, put that to one side, we just don't know. So to summarize at this point, I think the conquest of Alexander triggered a series of events which ultimately ended up with Buddhism arriving in China. So it changed the world, there's no doubt about that. And I've been arguing that this spread of Buddhism took with it the alloy brass and possibly also lost wax casting. But I want to finish with yet another unknown. I want to finish by saying I've been assuming all along, like a good Western scholar, that the art of making brass was a Western invention and that it travelled eastwards. And I've fingered Buddhism as the mechanism for doing it. That may or may not be true. There are competing claims for where the earliest alloy of brass was made. I've shown you some evidence from Western Asia and Persia, Iran, but it's rare. It's 37 amongst 10,000 objects that we know of. It's rare. It's also present in India. Oh, let me skip. Oh, sorry, I've got out of order. If we look at early examples of brass in Western Asia, Chris Thornton and other scholars have listed copper objects containing zinc, and they go back to Tepe-Yahya in Iran, mid-second millennium. Paul Craddock's done some work on Asia Minor. There's a famous pin from Giza in Palestine, 23.4% zinc. And I've shown you that data. This table is from Chris Thornton's work. I've inverted it to put the earliest. So Thermi, a name which is probably familiar to Greek scholars, has early 3rd millennium brass, 12%, blah, 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 Tepe-Yahya. So it's there, but it's rare. In India, it's there, but it's even rarer. This is some data that is incorporated in the graph that I showed you. So this is Taxila. This is the 34.34%. If anybody can find that and reanalyze it, we'll be eternally grateful. We don't even know where it is. And then Chandra Reddy produced some data on Afghanistan, and you've got zinc there. So we know it's there, but there are earlier examples in the Harappan period. Vashant Shinde has published some data on a 3rd millennium site, and out of 31 objects, 4 have got significant amounts of zinc in them. So in 3rd millennium India, in the Harappan civilization, again, we're seeing rare examples of this stuff turning up. So what about China? Well, China is contentious, as all things are relating to this sort of thing. There are some pieces which are said to come from Neolithic contexts which are definitely brass. There's no doubt about them being brass. The question is whether they really come from Neolithic contexts. So if I show you the object in question is this thing here. Now it's got 25% zinc, and it comes from a site in Bampo, which is near Xi'an, it's Neolithic. It could date to around 4000 BCE. If it does, then not only is it the earliest piece of brass in the world, it's one of the earliest pieces of metal in the world. I mean, there are earlier, but it's early. It's very early. Unfortunately, the rest of this paper is not terribly helpful because these are modern replications designed to show that you can make brass from a single smelt of a copper zinc mixed ore, which, yes, you can do it. But there are others. This rather unprepossessing object, which is broken in two, is also from a Neolithic site, but this time in Shandong province, right on the east coast of China. And this has 22, 20, 26, 23% zinc in it. So we have at least two examples of the Neolithic in China where they've got this weird material. If you look at this, oh dear, that's not worked too well, sorry. This just summarizes, so this is the first sheet, circular sheet, 4,700. There's another object, and then these are the two that I've just shown you. And then there's nothing until the Western Zhou dynasty, 1000 BCE, bronze, so-called bronze arrowheads, which have 10.9% zinc in them. So I have a problem. If these things are true, then not only did China invent the alloy that we call brass, but it had it far earlier than anywhere else, and it was making metal as early, maybe contemporary as early, with the earliest sites in Europe, in Serbia and in Western Anatolia. So it's really weird. And what's different about these objects is that if you think back to the Western Asian stuff that I've shown you, it's a small handful amongst a much larger collection. The issue with these things is, as far as we can see, that's all there is. There's no other metal around at that time. So not only were they the first to do it, but they didn't do anything else. I mean, I was going to say it doesn't make sense. But it doesn't really make sense. And then they forgot about it until maybe 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years later, when metallurgy re-enters China, if you buy this story, from the West, through Xinjiang and the typical story. I'll miss that and just go to a conclusion. So we have a number of really quite disputed things to think about China itself. Did it have these very rare pieces of brass in the Neolithic? Remember, the Neolithic is the old Stone Age. It's not, metal's not supposed to be there. Well, we know it is, but and if so, why did they not do anything else? Why is there nothing else there? And why did they forget about it for 2,000 years? So we don't know where this alloy called brass was invented. I would argue that we've got pretty solid evidence for the vector of Buddhism, and back to Alexander, bringing new technologies into China. I think it did bring, or re-bring, if you want to buy this Chinese story, to reintroduce brass into China. And did it bring lost wax casting, or was that already an indigenous invention, or was it the result of earlier contacts with the West? They may or may not have existed. So I think if I can leave you with more questions than answers, I'd probably like to just finish there and say thank you. Thank you.
what about Alexander?
Yeah, he brought brass with him, had it in his pockets. He weighted his elephants down with it. No, it wasn't him with the elephants, was it? I told you it was a bit of a cop-out. Please, there's a...
Okay. Well, I have two questions, basically. And a smaller remark about the latest thing you said about the Chinese. I mean, we have a Greek example about the inventions gone missing for thousands of years. Like we have Eron, who played around with a kind of steam engine toys, but it took another 2,000 years for the British to invent the actual steam engine. So, as far as I'm concerned, the Chinese invention sounds as legit as it can. So my question is, you said about, you made all these connections from the Buddhist into China about the copper, but I don't really see I can't see the point that it was Alexander that brought the bronze technology that far. I mean, how can we tell it was Alexander and not a side effect from the Greco-Persian wars, which go about 100 years before that?
Let me answer that before you ask the second question. Yes, it wasn't Alexander. I think the point about the Alexandrian conquest was that it brought this part of Central Asia into contact with the Hellenistic world, which it had been before, but not to the extent that the ruling elite were Greek-speaking, which is what happened. So I think, you know, it's not quite such a catchy title to say that you know, Hellenistic contacts change the world, but that's really what it's about. But I think you can, if you read, I was just looking for the quote that I had from Codrington. This quote, I think, captures what I'm talking about. So the Hellenistic period of Indian history is what Codrington called it in the 1940s. And he said imported objects, including bronze from Rome or Alexandria, found their way into Kabul. So I think it's that vector that's the important, not necessarily the personality of Alexander.
Well, I'm not referring to Alexander as a person. I'm referring to the era, because I mean, the Greco-Persian wars were going on for about 50 years. So, I mean, you know, if we just consider Murphy's Law, I mean, what's the most, not Murphy's Law, Occam's razor, what's the most likely thing to have happened? Like you have like this art and technology transfer during a 50-year period or during a 13-year period?
Well, but I think it's a continuous process. And I mean, I think most of it's invisible to us. And I think the key point is that the spread of Hellenistic culture eastwards is responsible for Buddhist Gandharan art, and that's responsible for what happened in China later. So let's just agree to call it Hellenistic influences.
Just a question that may be nonsensical at all. You have this very rare 37 out of 10,000, and then occasionally here and there in prehistory. Is there a chance that this was truly accidental? In other words, the ore that was smelted had some zinc in it. And so we find these rare specimens and we try to make a story why it may be that just the ore that was used had these traces.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's what happened. If I was to go into that database more carefully, I can show you that around the mid-second millennium, there's a big change, BC, and what happens is metallic tin becomes available, in my opinion, and that the direct alloying of copper and tin becomes available. So before that, you've got at least 1,000 years, maybe more. I mean, it could start in the 5th millennium, of what I call the experimental phase. That's not the right term, but the way I see it is that the recipe for producing this useful stuff called copper is take a couple of handfuls of this stuff and maybe a couple of handfuls of this stuff and mix it together and see what comes out. And if you look at the composition of objects before this sort of mid-second millennium, you see a much wider range of compositions, you know, not major, but, you know, 1% nickel, 1% antimony. And that's probably just because it's coming in with a mixed ore and they're smelting it, and a handful of them turn out to contain zinc and they're retaining the zinc in the object. I'm sure that's right. I mean, accidental is the wrong word because I don't think it was accidental. I think it was experimental. I think, you know, and I think what they were doing was saying, well, we know the stuff from that mountain is good, and we know the stuff from this mountain is good, so let's mix them together and see what happens. And I think, and you get all sorts of strange compositions coming out. And then by the mid-second millennium, they're beginning to be much more targeted, in my view, and they're able to get metallic tin or at least cassiterite, and to make tin bronzes. Because tin bronzes don't appear really on any major scale until about that period.
Yeah, Mark, thank you really very much for that nice overview. I much appreciated and enjoyed it. And I fully agree with you that these early, colorful, dirty, whatever you call them, copper alloys are probably just natural alloys from naturally mixed ore. Geology does the mixing for you easily. You don't even need to take from here and there. And I think I would agree with that orthodoxy for the very early brasses and early bronzes that we have in the 4th millennium and so on. In the West, that stuff disappears after Troy, more or less. And the Romans only came up with it, or the Lydians, and then around 1st century BC, so after Alexander. And then the Romans made it intentionally brass, I mean, at a very large scale. You mentioned the coinage, in a well-controlled process, in closed crucibles. They knew what they were doing for a couple hundred years. So very different technology to the early natural alloys. What I was wondering is what your take is on the later brasses in China and in India, which are too clean, in my view, to be these natural alloys that you highlighted for the early stuff. Do we have cementation there? Do we have any archaeological evidence for it in China and India?
No, a slightly hesitating no. There is some evidence. It's really interesting because I think the earliest use of zinc is in zinc oxide as a medicine. And they were mining calamine zinc ore for medicine. And long before they were smelting copper and brass. And some of these early zinc mines in India also have little piles of slag in them. So the suspicion is that they're also experimenting with this stuff. And I think that they did have, in fact, my Sanskrit is even worse than my Chinese, but there are some references in sort of 8th, 9th century texts, Sanskrit texts, which I think are quite clearly something like a calamine process. In fact, I think what they were doing is something like making kimchi, pickling. I think they were putting layers of stuff together and then putting a casserole in the fire, and I think they were making breast that way, which is a version of the calamine process. And that could be quite early, I think. And I think the connection with making food is quite an interesting connection as well.
Mark, my question has to do with the argument you made about Buddhism being the vehicle carrying brass, right? And I wanted to ask you about if we know a little bit about the cultural context related to the materiality, the technique, the making, the makers of these objects, and whether that could help us understand how that vehicle and how those agents carrying that experience together with iconography and style worked. And I'm thinking as a comparison, let's say the makers of Byzantine icons in certain times where the materiality of the icons was a vehicle to transmit and transfer technology.
I think we're getting into the area of your favorite subject, which is monasteries. The early Buddhism in China tends to be in the form of rock-cut temples. In the West, they're cut into the sort of the desert, loose, compacted, sandstone-y stuff. In the West, in Yongan, they're cut into the hard rock. But they're cave temples, and I think this is derived from the Indian technology of, if you think of Ajanta caves, it's a Buddhist thing in northern India. So I think when it first comes in, it's a cave temple concept, but associated with the cave temples are Buddhist monks, and they live there. There are caves in Dunhuang, for instance, which are monks' caves for sleeping in. They're not worshipped in, as far as we know. They're undecorated. So I think once you begin to build up Buddhist communities, then I think you begin to bring in specialist persons. And the most obvious example is the cave paintings, where they, by the 4th and 5th century, they are doing spectacular fresco work on cave temple walls. And they must be bringing in specialists who know about this. So there's no evidence, but one would also assume that they're also bringing in specialist metal workers to make the figures, to do the gilding. So I think it's probably, the vector is probably the monasteries and the monks that go. The early contact is simply about collecting texts. In the Chinese literature, you read about certain monks traveling west to collect religious texts, which are then brought back and translated. But by the 4th and 5th centuries, there are monasteries, or at least cave temples with monks in them. I don't know when the earliest freestanding monastery would be, but certainly the cave temples are early, and they would have had, I think, specialist people brought in to do it. We look like we're done.